On the morning of February 10, 1306, a man knelt on the cold stone floor of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, bleeding from a wound in his side. He was a Scottish nobleman named John Comyn. He was, by some accounts, the legitimate claimant to the Scottish throne, and standing over him, dagger still wet, was the man who would within months be crowned King of Scotland. That second man was Robert the Bruce. For more than 700 years, historians have argued about what really happened inside that church, about who struck first, about whether it was murder, manslaughter, or something even older and uglier than either, about whether the man Scotland would later remember as its greatest hero began his reign by committing the most damning act a medieval Christian could commit: sacrilege, bloodshed on consecrated ground, the killing of a kinsman beneath the eyes of God. And that argument, that unresolved dispute at the very foundation of Scottish nationhood, might be the most uncomfortable truth in all of British history. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and hit subscribe to understand why Scotland's greatest hero may have started his legend by becoming a murderer. To understand what Robert the Bruce did, you have to understand the world he was trying to survive in. Scotland in the year 1306 was not a country, not really. It was the shattered remains of a country, occupied, garrisoned, and administered by a foreign king who had decided, somewhere in the deep machinery of his ambition, that the Scots were no longer entitled to govern themselves. That king was Edward I of England. The Scots called him Longshanks for his height. They also called him the Hammer of the Scots, a title he reportedly enjoyed. It would eventually be carved onto his tomb. For 10 years, Edward had been systematically dismantling Scottish sovereignty. He had stripped the country of its symbols. He had taken the stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone upon which every Scottish king had been crowned for centuries, and transported it to Westminster Abbey, where it sat beneath the English coronation chair as a deliberate insult. He had taken the Scottish crown jewels. He had taken the royal records. He had installed English sheriffs in Scottish counties. He had garrisoned English soldiers in Scottish castles. He had reduced the Scottish Parliament to an advisory body that met when he permitted it to meet and dispersed when he told it to disperse. The Scottish nobility was not unified against him. That was perhaps the most devastating fact of the era. Scotland in 1306 was divided into factions, families, and rival claims. There were lords who had sworn allegiance to Edward because they had no realistic alternative. There were lords who fought him openly and died for it. There were lords who played both sides, sending warm letters to London while quietly funding resistance in the Highlands. The country was not a unit. It was a collection of feuding dynasties trying to survive an occupation, and the occupation was winning. The most visible symbol of that defeat had occurred just 1 year earlier. In August 1305, William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had led the popular resistance against English rule, was captured near Glasgow, transported to London in chains, and put on trial for treason. Wallace pointed out, correctly, that he could not have committed treason against Edward because he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. The court ignored this argument. He was condemned anyway. He was dragged through the streets behind horses, hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled while still conscious, beheaded, and finally hacked into 4 pieces. His head was placed on a pike on London Bridge. His 4 quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as warnings. That was what Edward did to Scotsmen who resisted him. And every Scottish lord knew it. Every Scottish lord, including Robert the Bruce, had watched what happened to Wallace and understood the calculation that had been laid in front of them. You could kneel and live as a vassal in a country that was no longer your own. Or you could resist and end the way Wallace ended, in pieces, displayed on pikes across the cities you had tried to free. There was no third option. Or so it seemed. The first formal accusation against Robert the Bruce did not come from a Scottish chronicler. It did not come from an English sheriff. It came from Rome. On May 18, 1306, just 3 months after the killing at Greyfriars Church, Pope Clement V issued a bull of excommunication against Robert the Bruce. The document was specific. It accused him of sacrilege, of murder on consecrated ground, of breaking the peace of God within the walls of a Franciscan church. The excommunication did not merely cast Bruce out of the Catholic communion. It declared his soul forfeit. It declared that any Christian who supported him risked the same fate. It declared, in effect, that Robert the Bruce was a man cursed by heaven before he was ever crowned a king. That bull was not Scottish gossip. It was not English propaganda. It was the formal judgment of the highest spiritual authority in medieval Europe, and it carried diplomatic weight in every court from Paris to Constantinople. By the time the ink was dry on that document, the accusation of betrayal was already spreading faster than Bruce could move to counter it. He had killed a kinsman. He had killed him in a church. He had killed him under what appeared, depending on which chronicler you trusted, to have been a flag of truce. The act had a name now, and that name was murder. And the act had been committed, his enemies whispered, for one reason only: to clear a path to the throne. The first theory, the one that has haunted Bruce's reputation longest, is the simplest. It is also the darkest. It says he planned it. In this version of the story, Robert the Bruce was a calculating political operator who had spent years maneuvering toward the Scottish crown and had finally identified the one obstacle that could not be removed by diplomacy. That obstacle was John Comyn, the Lord of Badenoch, sometimes called the Red Comyn for the color of his arms. Comyn was a powerful magnate in his own right. He commanded loyalty from a network of northern Scottish families. He had served as a guardian of Scotland during the interregnum, and most dangerously for Bruce, he had a credible claim to the throne through his own bloodline. The Comyns and the Bruces were rivals not just politically but dynastically. They wanted the same crown. In the Cold Murderer reading, Bruce summoned Comyn to Greyfriars Church under the pretense of discussing a unified Scottish resistance to English rule. He chose the church deliberately, knowing that Comyn would assume the sanctity of the location guaranteed his safety. He arrived with armed retainers. He confronted Comyn at the high altar, and when the conversation went the way he had always planned for it to go, he drew a dagger and finished his rival in the place where rivals were supposed to be safe. The murder in this version was not a moment of passion. It was the execution of a long-considered plan. Bruce knew the theological cost. He knew the political cost. He had decided, somewhere in the calculation of his ambition, that becoming the King of Scots was worth being damned for. The evidence for this reading is circumstantial but real. Bruce had himself crowned at Scone just 6 weeks later, on March 25, 1306. He had clearly prepared the coronation in advance. He had robes ready. He had supporters mobilized. He had the Bishop of St. Andrews and the Bishop of Glasgow waiting to perform the ceremony, both of whom risked excommunication themselves by participating. None of that was improvised. None of that could have been arranged in the days following an unplanned killing. The machinery of a coronation requires weeks of preparation, and Bruce's coronation began moving forward almost the moment Comyn stopped breathing. To the Cold Murderer theorists, that is the smoking gun. Bruce did not stumble into the throne. He walked toward it across his cousin's body. The second theory rejects almost all of that and offers a different account of what happened inside the church. In this version, Robert the Bruce did not go to Greyfriars to kill John Comyn. He went there to confront him. The story begins not in 1306 but in the months before, when Bruce and Comyn had reportedly entered into a secret pact. The terms of that pact, according to several chroniclers, were straightforward. One of them would claim the throne of Scotland. The other would surrender his own claim in exchange for the surrendering lord's lands and titles. The two great rival families would unite behind a single candidate, end their generations-long feud, and present a united front against English occupation. It was, by the brutal standards of medieval Scottish politics, a reasonable bargain. It was also extremely dangerous. Such a pact, if discovered by Edward I, would be treated as open treason by both signatories. The English king had not occupied Scotland to allow his vassals to negotiate succession arrangements behind his back. According to the provoked man theory, Comyn betrayed the pact. He sent word of it to Edward. He named Bruce as the proposed king. He hoped perhaps that the English crown would reward him for his loyalty by elevating him over Bruce or by simply removing Bruce from the picture entirely. Edward, in this account, sent letters back to Scotland that exposed the betrayal. Word reached Bruce, and Bruce, knowing that his life was now measured in weeks rather than years, rode to Dumfries to confront the man who had sold him. The argument inside Greyfriars in this version was not a planned confrontation. It was an accusation. Bruce accused Comyn of treachery. Comyn denied it, or perhaps defended it, or perhaps mocked Bruce for being naive enough to expect loyalty in such a world. The conversation escalated. Steel came out. A blow was struck. And then Bruce, suddenly aware of what he had done and what he had not yet finished, called for his retainers, who entered the church and made certain that Comyn would not survive the wound. This is the theory that medieval Scottish chroniclers tended to favor, particularly John Barbour, whose long poem The Bruise was composed in the 1370s and became the foundational literary account of Bruce's reign. Barbour wrote with obvious partisan sympathy, but he was working from oral traditions that had survived through the lifetimes of men who had fought alongside Bruce. In Barbour's telling, Bruce did not arrive at Greyfriars planning to murder. He arrived planning to confront a traitor. The murder was the consequence of that confrontation, not its purpose. The third theory is the strangest and the most unsettling. It suggests that the meeting at Greyfriars was not arranged by Bruce or by Comyn at all. It was arranged by Edward I, working through intermediaries on both sides, with the deliberate intention of bringing the two most powerful claimants to the Scottish throne into the same room at the same time, and letting their mutual suspicion do the rest. In this reading, Edward had become aware of the secret pact between Bruce and Comyn through his own spy network, which was extensive and effective. He understood that the pact, if it held, would produce a united Scotland with a single king and a coherent strategy of resistance. That outcome was unacceptable, but killing both men openly would create martyrs. It would unify the country in grief. So instead, Edward arranged for each man to receive information that would poison him against the other. He arranged for the meeting at Greyfriars to be proposed under terms that would seem reasonable to both parties. He ensured that each man arrived believing the other intended to betray him, and he let the natural chemistry of medieval Scottish politics, that combustible mixture of pride, kinship grievance, and dynastic rivalry, do the rest. The trap in this version succeeded perfectly. Comyn died. Bruce became a fugitive king with an excommunication hanging over his head. Scotland was leaderless within its own ostensible leadership, and Edward, sitting in Westminster, prepared to march north and finish what should have been finished years before. What Edward did not anticipate was that the man he had pushed into the impossible position would refuse to break under it. That is the part of the third theory that historians find most compelling. The trap worked. Bruce just refused to lie down in it. None of these theories cancel each other out. The historical record is fragmentary, contradictory, and shaped by the partisan interests of the men who wrote it down. What is not in dispute is that John Comyn died in Greyfriars Church on February 10, 1306, and that Robert the Bruce was the man who killed him. The why is where 7 centuries of argument have lived. There is a question larger than any of the 3 theories, and it is the question Scotland eventually had to answer for itself. What does a country do when its greatest hero began his reign with a murder? For a fractured nation living under foreign occupation, the answer turned out to be straightforward. It rewrote the murder. It transformed it from betrayal into necessity. It absorbed the killing into the larger story of national survival, where any individual moral cost could be justified by the greater good of restored sovereignty. This was not cynical. It was psychological. A country that needed a king could not afford to remember that king as a kinslayer. A country that needed unity could not afford to dwell on the act that had divided it. The story of Robert the Bruce had to become the story of a man who had been forced by circumstance into terrible choices, and who had emerged from those choices to deliver his people from bondage. The murder at Greyfriars had to become a tragedy rather than a crime. A wound that the king carried rather than one he had inflicted. The rewriting accelerated dramatically after the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314. Bruce, against odds that no military analyst would have backed, defeated an English army nearly 3 times the size of his own in 2 days of brutal fighting in the marshlands south of Stirling Castle. The English king at that point was Edward II, the son of Longshanks, and Edward II proved to be a substantially less capable commander than his father had been. But the victory at Bannockburn was not just a tactical achievement, it was a transformation. It turned Bruce from a fugitive excommunicate into an undeniable national savior. After Bannockburn, the question of whether his kingship was legitimate became almost irrelevant. The kingship had been ratified by the only authority that mattered in the medieval world: victory in battle. The excommunication was eventually lifted. Pope John XXII formally recognized Bruce as King of Scotland in 1324, 18 years after the killing at Greyfriars. The Declaration of Arbroath, written by Scottish nobles in 1320, became the foundational statement of Scottish independence, and named Bruce explicitly as the rightful king through whom that independence would be secured. Scotland had decided, collectively and definitively, what it wanted to remember. It wanted to remember the king. It would let the murderer fade. This is how every nation handles its founders. Every flag in the world has a body buried somewhere beneath it. Every constitution was written by men who had done things that, judged outside the context of their cause, would have hanged them. The function of national mythology is to convert necessary violence into sacred sacrifice. Scotland's project of converting Bruce was not unique. It was just particularly visible because the murder was particularly stark. What changes across centuries is not the act itself. The act stays exactly what it was. What changes is the lens through which the act is permitted to be seen. To understand the killing at Greyfriars, you have to understand the men who were not in the church but whose lives shaped what happened inside it. The first of them is the man who died there, John Comyn. The Comyns were one of the most powerful families in medieval Scotland. They held vast estates in the north, in Badenoch and Lochaber, and through marriage and inheritance had accumulated a network of allied lordships that made them, by some measures, even more powerful than the Bruces. John Comyn the Red, as he was sometimes called, was not a minor figure who happened to die in a church. He was a serious contender for the throne. His mother had been the sister of John Balliol, the King Edward I had installed, and then deposed when Balliol proved insufficiently compliant. That bloodline gave Comyn a claim that, by the dynastic logic of the time, was at least as strong as Bruce's and possibly stronger. Comyn had served as one of the guardians of Scotland during the interregnum following Balliol's deposition. He had led Scottish forces in the field. He had negotiated with the French crown for military support. By any reasonable measure, he was qualified for the throne he was prevented from taking. When he died at Greyfriars, Scotland did not lose an irrelevant relative of the king. It lost a parallel king. A man who, under different circumstances, would have been remembered the way Bruce came to be remembered. But Comyn was on the losing side of history. The Comyn family was systematically dismantled in the years after his death. Their castles were taken. Their lands were redistributed to Bruce loyalists. Their name was effectively erased from Scottish political life. The winners write the history, and the winners had a particular interest in ensuring that no one remembered what John Comyn might have been. The second figure is William Wallace. Wallace's execution in August 1305 was not just the death of a single resistance leader. It was the demonstration to every Scottish noble of exactly what awaited them if they chose open resistance. Wallace had not been a great lord. He had been a knight of relatively modest origin who had risen to lead a popular uprising. He commanded the loyalty of ordinary Scots in ways that the great noble families, with their feuds and their compromises, could not. And his death was designed to terrify exactly the men who might have followed his example. It worked in the short term. The Scottish resistance fractured after Wallace's execution. Nobles who had been edging toward open rebellion went quiet. Edward consolidated his administrative control over the country. The English garrison commanders reported back to London that Scotland was, at last, pacified. But Wallace's death also made one specific outcome inevitable. It guaranteed that the next great Scottish resistance, if it came, would come from a different kind of figure, not from a knight of modest origin who could be made an example of, from a great noble with great resources who could not be casually killed without provoking war. The next leader of Scottish resistance would have to be someone the English could not simply hang. Bruce was that someone. The example of Wallace told him exactly what would happen to him if he failed, and exactly why he could not afford to fail. The third figure is Edward I himself. Edward had spent the final decade of his life on the Scottish question. He had marched armies north repeatedly. He had personally directed sieges. He had built castles to garrison the country. He had pursued Wallace across the Highlands and ultimately taken him. By 1306, he was 67 years old, sick, increasingly frail, and apparently convinced that the conquest of Scotland was a project he was about to complete. He died on July 7, 1307, on the road north, attempting to lead one final campaign against the now-anointed King Robert. His son Edward II inherited the war and inherited none of his father's competence in waging it. The historical irony is sharp enough to taste. If Edward I had lived even 5 more years, Bruce might have been crushed before Bannockburn ever happened, and the murder at Greyfriars might be remembered only as the squalid origin of a failed pretender. The accusation of betrayal would have stood unchallenged. Bruce became a hero because Edward I died before he could finish the job. History often turns on accidents of mortality. The biographies of national founders are full of close calls that, in slightly different versions of the world, would have left those founders forgotten or condemned. Scotland is not the only nation with a founder whose loyalty was once questioned. The patterns repeat across cultures, and they repeat for the same reasons. Empires fall, contested successions create opportunities for ambitious men, and ambitious men do things that look, in real time, indistinguishable from treason. In France, the figure of Joan of Arc was tried and burned in 1431 on charges that included heresy, witchcraft, and inappropriate dress. She was 19 years old. The English-aligned ecclesiastical court that condemned her did so with the full conviction that she was a traitor to legitimate Christian authority. It took the French crown 25 years to formally rehabilitate her memory through a nullification trial in 1456, and another 4.5 centuries before the Catholic Church canonized her in 1920. The girl who had led French armies to victory at Orleans was, for a long stretch of her own history, officially remembered as a traitor. In Italy, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the man who unified the peninsula in the 1860s, spent decades of his life branded a revolutionary, a separatist, and a destabilizer of legitimate Italian states. The various kingdoms and papal territories he campaigned against issued formal denunciations of him as a traitor to Catholic order. He died in 1882 as a national hero, but the labels that had been attached to him during his most active years did not fully disappear from European political discourse until well into the 20th century. In Eastern Europe, the Czech religious reformer Jan Hus was burned at the stake in 1415 for heresy after being lured to the Council of Constance under an imperial promise of safe conduct, which was then revoked. He has since become a Czech national hero. A national holiday is observed on the anniversary of his execution. But for the first 2 centuries after his death, Hus's name carried the legal weight of formal religious betrayal, and supporting his memory could itself be treated as treason in territories that remained Catholic. The pattern is the same in each case. The accusation of betrayal precedes the elevation to heroism. The rehabilitation comes later, often centuries later, when the political circumstances that produced the original accusation have changed, and a new political need requires a new kind of founding story. Nations do not honor their heroes in real time. They honor them in retrospect, after the surviving establishment has decided which version of events it wants to be true. Robert the Bruce's literary rehabilitation began in 1375, when John Barber, Archdeacon of Aberdeen, composed his epic poem The Bruce. The work runs to roughly 14,000 lines of Scots verse and presents Bruce as a national hero whose every action, including the killing at Greyfriars, was either justified or providentially ordained. Barber was writing during the reign of Bruce's grandson, Robert II, the first Stuart King of Scotland. The political incentive to produce a sympathetic account of the dynasty's founder was substantial. Barber produced it. The Bruce became the dominant Scottish account of Bruce's life. It was copied, recopied, paraphrased, and excerpted across the centuries. By the time later historians began to question its accuracy, its narrative had become inseparable from Scottish national identity. To challenge Barber's account of Bruce was, in some sense, to challenge Scotland itself. The poem had succeeded at its work. The legend evolved through the modern era in ways that reflected the changing political needs of the country that had inherited it. In 1996, the British government announced the return of the Stone of Scone to Scotland. The stone had sat beneath the English coronation chair at Westminster for exactly 700 years. Ever since Edward I had carried it south in 1296. Its return was a political gesture made in the context of growing devolutionary pressure within the United Kingdom, and the stone was installed in Edinburgh Castle on St. Andrew's Day, November 30, 1996. The ceremony invoked Robert the Bruce explicitly. Speakers reminded the assembled crowds that the king who had ultimately delivered Scotland from the loss of the stone had been a man written off in his own lifetime as a murderer and an excommunicate. In 2014, Scotland held a referendum on independence from the United Kingdom. The independence campaign drew heavily on the imagery of Bruce and Bannockburn. The 700th anniversary of the battle fell 3 months before the vote, and commemorative events at the Bannockburn battlefield were attended by political leaders from across the Scottish independence movement. The referendum ultimately failed, with 55% of voters choosing to remain in the United Kingdom. But the campaign demonstrated the continuing political utility of Bruce's name. 700 years after his death, he was still a vehicle for arguments about Scottish self-determination. Modern cinema reshaped his memory in 2 distinct waves. The first was Mel Gibson's Braveheart in 1995, which was, despite its title, primarily a film about William Wallace. Bruce appeared as a secondary character, portrayed as a vacillating noble who eventually finds his courage. The film took substantial liberties with the historical record. It compressed timelines, invented characters, and presented Bruce's relationship with Wallace as personal in ways the historical record does not support. Many historians objected to the film's accuracy, but it brought the Scottish independence story to a global audience of tens of millions of viewers, and it cemented Bruce in popular memory as a man who had needed to be persuaded into greatness. The second wave was David Mackenzie's Outlaw King in 2018. The film focused directly on Bruce, with Chris Pine in the title role. It opened with the killing at Greyfriars and depicted that killing as exactly the kind of half-planned, half-accidental confrontation that the provoked man theory describes. The film acknowledged the moral complexity of Bruce's path to the throne in a way Braveheart had not. It depicted him as a man who had crossed a moral line he could never uncross, and who had then spent the rest of his life trying to justify that crossing through his actions as king. Outlaw King was not as commercially successful as Braveheart, but it represented a more sophisticated cultural willingness to look at Bruce's origin story without flinching. The murder was no longer something Scotland needed to hide. It had become something Scotland could examine. Robert the Bruce died on June 7, 1329, at his manor of Cardross on the north bank of the Clyde. He was 54 years old. The contemporary records suggest he died of what may have been leprosy, though the diagnosis is contested, and modern historians have proposed various alternatives including syphilis and motor neuron disease. The cause is uncertain. The fact is not. The king who had begun his reign on the floor of Greyfriars Church died in his bed, surrounded by his household. With the kingdom he had one secure around him. His body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey, in the traditional resting place of Scottish kings. His heart was removed before burial, embalmed, and given to his friend Sir James Douglas, with instructions to carry it on crusade to the Holy Land. Douglas got as far as Spain, where he died in battle against the Moors at the Battle of Teba in 1330, the casket containing Bruce's heart still around his neck. The heart was recovered from the battlefield and returned to Scotland, where it was eventually interred at Melrose Abbey. So Bruce ended his life literally divided, his body in one place, his heart in another. A man who had spent his reign trying to reconcile the irreconcilable, kingship and kinslaying, victory and damnation, and who in death continued to embody the division that had defined him. The two halves are still there. You can visit Dunfermline Abbey today and stand over the slab beneath which his bones rest. You can travel to Melrose Abbey and stand at the small lead casket that, when it was excavated and examined in 1996, was found to contain the embalmed organ of a medieval Scottish king. There is no other monarch in British history whose physical remains are split between two consecrated sites this way. There is no other king who is, in a literal architectural sense, two graves. That division feels appropriate, because the question of who Robert the Bruce really was has never resolved into a single answer. He was both things at once. He was the murderer who killed his cousin on the steps of an altar, and he was the king who delivered his country from foreign occupation. He was the excommunicate cursed by the Pope, and he was the founder of a dynasty that ruled Scotland for centuries. He was the man who broke the deepest taboo his civilization recognized, and he was the man his civilization decided to forgive. The accusation of betrayal was not a slander invented by his enemies. It was a true description of an act he genuinely committed. The heroism that followed was not a fiction invented by his admirers. It was a true description of victories he genuinely won. Both descriptions apply to the same man at the same time, and the question of which one history chooses to emphasize depends entirely on who is doing the choosing. That is, in the end, the unsettling truth at the foundation of Scottish nationhood and of every nationhood. The men who found countries are not saints. They are operators who survived long enough to make their version of events become the version everyone else remembers. Their betrayals become necessary sacrifices. Their crimes become founding myths. Their bloodstains become consecrations. This is not cynicism. It is simply how the work of memory gets done. Robert the Bruce understood this. He understood it on the floor of Greyfriars Church when he made the decision he could never take back. He understood it at his coronation 6 weeks later when he accepted a crown that had been purchased with the death of a kinsman. He understood it across the 23 years of his reign as he built the legitimacy that would, after his death, allow Scotland to remember him as a hero. He spent his whole life paying for the murder. The country he served spent the next 700 years deciding what to call the payment. So there it is. 700 years of contested history compressed into a single morning inside a single church in southwest Scotland. A killing that was either premeditated murder, provoked manslaughter, or the product of an English trap, depending on which medieval chronicler you trust and which modern historian you read. A king who was either a kinslayer or a savior, depending on whether you stood inside his country or outside it. A hero whose heroism was inseparable from a crime, because the crime was the act that made the heroism possible. Robert the Bruce did not become Scotland's greatest hero in spite of the accusation of betrayal. He became Scotland's greatest hero through it. The blood on the altar at Greyfriars was the price of the crown at Scone, and the crown at Scone was the price of the victory at Bannockburn, and the victory at Bannockburn was the price of everything that came after. You cannot remove one piece of that chain without removing all of it. That is the man Scotland remembers, not the innocent hero of popular legend. The flawed, bloodied, brilliant survivor who did a terrible thing on a winter morning in 1306 and then spent the rest of his life trying to make the world believe it had been worth doing. If you found this story haunting, hit subscribe and let the next one uncover the man behind the myth.